Welcome to Complex Creatures, exploring spirituality and the common good.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to Complex Creatures, a podcast where we explore how spirituality is a tool that we can use not only for our personal development and growth, but for the public sphere and how we relate to one another in this space. So, called the world. My name is Jarrod Longbonds. I'm a senior minister at a historic church in Midtown Atlanta, Georgia, called Peachtree Christian Church. I have a PhD in theology, and I'm very fascinated by all things theology, religion, spirituality, and also ethics. Just very curious person. I'm with my good friend, another curious soul. His name is Alan. How you doing, Alan?
Doing great, man. How are you?
Oh man, I'm doing okay. Doing okay. Been busy, and I know that you have too. And that's why today I wanted to talk about one of the spiritual tools that we see perennially across traditions. And let me, before I get there, let me just say, when people use the phrase, if you've ever heard it, the perennial philosophy or perennial traditions or something, it's really a nod toward the thought that there's something common across all philosophies. In some ways, it can be used in a reductive way. People have talked about the perennial philosophy in the way that they reduce down the uniquenesses of religions and mythologies and philosophies to say, hey, really all saying the same thing. That's not how I take it. I take it that something that's in perennial philosophy or perennial within the world of spiritualities is ever present kind of everywhere, something that's truthful that we've as humans latched onto or talked about in different languages and different modes. Does that make any sense when I say perennial?
It absolutely does. Actually, what I wanted to ask you was if you got the phrase from Aldous Huxley's book or if Aldous Huxley got that from some common source for the two of you.
I don't know if there is other sources. I'm just agnostic on that, but I did, in fact, first stumble across it there, but I've heard it used many times since in reference to his text and reference to other texts and other styles of thinking. So yeah, definitely from Aldous Huxley. So when I wrote a lot of my doctoral research on in the environmental crisis and environmentalist philosophies, as they compared to the Christian doctrines of creation and incarnation and the 7th century thinker Maximus the Confessor, I really dove deep into the world of nature spirituality, nature religion, narratives of ecological decline. I mean, there's just a huge field with many subdisciplines within it. And a lot of the religious thinkers and spirituality thinkers in the environmental or eco world look back to Aldous Huxley's perennial philosophy. So that's where I was the first, came to it on my own study. Nevertheless, it applies perennially. We're going to talk today about a discipline, a practice of spirituality that seems to be ever present in traditions. Most traditions are at least a great majority of spiritual and religious traditions. And that is the discipline of solitude and silence. Now, those are two unique ones, and we'll talk more about them as we go further in the future. But they're often put together because often the point of seeking solitude is for also seeking silence. And more particularly today, I want to focus on the aspect of silence as a spiritual tool. I'm not sure if it's terribly exciting just to throw out to you today, hey, we're going to talk about silence. But here we are, Alan. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that word? What strikes you when you hear the word silence this morning?
So slightly off topic, but I'll tell you this anyway. I wrote a middle grade, I don't know what to call it, fantasy book, mystery book called Mangrooves about a bluegrass band that solves Scooby-Doo style mysteries, but they're all monsters. And one of my characters is a tree. He's a tree creature. He was surrounded by other trees who meditated in the woods and were just silent. And he was bored. He had to get up and leave. So that's actually what jumped through my head when you said this. But that having been said, I think that his story arc is learning why the silence is valuable, right?
That's cool. That's really cool. Did you draw any inspiration from Tolkien's Ent characters?
I did actually. So Tolkien and Groot were definitely both models for this guy.
Okay.
But but
Those
but
are
but he's a flute player, by the way. So I have this gag in the book where the largest creatures play the smallest instruments and the smallest creatures play largest instrument.
He's a flautist. That's great. That's great. I'd love to hear more about that. For our purposes today, I want to start by talking about a figure to me who's of great importance. And that is Fred Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I grew up my age. The children's programming that I grew up with was Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Sesame Street, and I have much more memories of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood as a kid than I do Sesame Street. I even remember when it sort of got cheesy to me, and maybe even neighborhood buddies would make fun of it. Although I'm certain we all went home and watched it. I remember in those days, even going home and hearing my dad say positive things about Fred Rogers, which was interesting because the way that he was made fun of by my, I think, overly macho male growing friends was that he was sort of a sissy or a wimp or something. And here's my dad praising what he saw on the television. And yeah, over the years, I found out that Fred Rogers was, in fact, an ordained Presbyterian minister in the Presbyterian USA Church. Very interesting to know about him is that when he sought ordination, he didn't want to serve a local congregation or preach in a pulpit. He wanted his ministry to be on television and specifically to children. And the church really struggled with ordaining him for that purpose. I mean, they didn't have the imagination that he had. Fred was not a fan of television. He saw early television as kind of a loud and boisterous thing that basically tried to sell you goods and services. Later, as his show developed, he never, I mean, he fought hard to never market to children. He did not want to turn children into consumers like other stations and programming did. He thought there was a way to elevate the medium, and it really starts by elevating the inner life of children. And a lot of this is born, and this isn't going to be a podcast all about Fred Rogers, but just a little background. A lot of it's born out of his own childhood insecurities. I mean, everyone that's watched the documentary knows that he was called Fat Freddy as a kid, and he was a kid of superior wealth. I mean, he was driven to school every day by a driver and driven home for lunch and driven back. But he was alienated, isolated, alone, and he learned over time, he learned how to be comfortable with silence because he was so often alone. And in the upstairs of his home, silently, he would play by himself. And that's where he started playing the land of make believe and playing with puppets and things of that nature. If you ever watch the show or go back and watch it, its pacing is completely unlike anything else on TV, especially in his tenure of being on TV. Do you remember how the establishing shot on the screen when you go into Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood? You see Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, you see the neighborhood behind him. It's a model set. But do you remember anything else about it, Alan, off the top of your head?
To be honest, no, it wasn't a big part of my childhood, but my daughter obsessed over Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, which is the modern equivalent.
Yes, it's the Fred Rogers Neighborhood organization or whatever it's called to allow that show to be, and it follows a lot of the philosophy.
Exactly.
But in the establishing shot before you move into the neighborhood and into his house is it's a blinking yellow traffic light,
Okay, okay.
which is a signal to the viewer
Slow down.
about the show. It's time to slow down, which is unlike if you think about like a lot of cartoons. I mean, from that era to now, it's like gear up, the engines are going, let's go. This is about slowing down, which fits his personality type big time. And he's going to explore the curiosities of the neighborhood and the curiosities of the inner self. He didn't want to be afraid to broach any topic with children because he felt like children were sometimes patronized in ways that weren't helpful. So the first years of the show, he discussed assassination because Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. He discussed border walls and wars because that was happening. And he even did things to show interracial bathing. I mean, him and Officer Clemens washed their feet in a pool together. And so he was subtly subversive. One time he says, do you know what a minute feels like? And he takes an egg timer and puts it on a minute and he stares at the camera quietly for a minute. Alan, that's not good TV.
No, let's see, what's the phrase for that? It's dead air, right?
Dead air. Yet his audience was captivated.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of reasons why. But what he did was he was comfortable with silence. And then later he would say to people, including people who've written books about him in biography reform, and there's another one that talks of his simple faith, he would say that he felt as though silence was his gift to other people. That the world was just not a, it wasn't a listening place. And that silence was a gift. Later, he did a show called Old Friends, New Friends. He took a break from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and he did a show that did not work. But it was an interview show, and he would interview folks like Yo-Yo Ma, and as a medium goes, it was poor TV because it was a lot of silence. But he would sit there, ask a question, and sit quietly to hear an answer, and then whenever there was dead air, he did not fill it with more talking. As an expert in interviewer, he sat quietly and leaned in still even more to get more out of the subject. The pacing, I think, and the timing, it was just too slow. But there's the ethic of silence baked into even a conversation. Why was this so important for Rogers? Because there's something that about the inner life that needs attended to, and so often talking loud, vocalizing, distracting world of noise stops us from attending to our inner world. I mean, I could have prepared better and pulled up all kinds of stats about the volume and noise of the world. It's incredibly hard to go to a place anywhere in our world and not hear artificial noise. It's even more rare to hear nothing at all. I mean the world is just full of sound. And sound is not bad, right? Talking is not bad. It's just that finding the space for silence is very hard to come by. In fact, I don't know how you feel, Alan, but I struggle when I'm on the move between one task to another. If I have to walk to another place in my building or drive, I struggle with just turning off sound. I usually put in my earbuds and listen to a podcast, an audible book, or music. What about you?
I'm the same way, but I've started a thing just recently, so don't think that I've perfected it by any stretch of the imagination with not turning on a podcast or music or something. And in my case, it's specifically because I read an interview with a writer that I'm a big fan of, and he mentioned that the best way to be creative is to be bored, you know.
Well, do you remember who that was?
Oh yeah, it's Neil Gaiman.
Yeah, yeah. Well, talk about it because I think I know some about what you're talking about, and I think there's some great stuff in there.
So I've been trying harder lately to not fill up every moment with the sound of the headphones and let that go so that I can think. I'm not good at it yet, but I'm trying.
I mean, no, I mean, can you say more about what he said, perchance?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the idea is simply this, that if you, you know, if you're listening to a podcast, you have a certain amount of information that you're learning and you're growing in a specific way, and that's awesome and I think appropriate in times. For me, if I'm listening to music, you know, because I'm a musician, I am taking it apart and thinking about the ways that I can do things that are similar to this piece of music, and there's definitely some growth there. So
Yeah.
it's not a waste of time by any stretch. I mean, even if you're just listening to music for pure enjoyment, a lot of times I mean, most of the time it's not a waste of time. Sometimes just listening to music can be meditative. But the specific thing that Gaiman was talking about was the idea that it's really difficult to ideate. It's really difficult to think about things that you want to create that are unique to you if all you're doing is reflecting the stuff that's coming at you, you know, being silent with yourself and trying to imagine and twist things around in your head and think through whatever it is that you might you know want to create is what that time's for. And more than that, I think that the a larger point that he was trying to make is this idea that you're never going to get to the big idea, to the moment, until you've kind of gone through all of these steps to get to the moment. And that takes time. And that time requires you to not be entertained by other things. It requires you to, as he puts it, be bored, you know, to to be alone with yourself long enough to cycle through to get to the thing that is actually in you.
Yeah, I heard him say somewhere where when he has a writing time, is his desk. I think it looks out a window at like the back garden, the backyard or whatnot, or maybe it's out on the back patio. But he says he has like a rule. He can do one of two things. He can either write or he can be bored and observe, but he can't scroll on his phone. He can't check his email. He can't turn
Mm.
on a podcast or television program.
Okay.
So If he's going to sit and write, it's writing time. And if he's going to do something else, it's just to sit and be bored, because maybe it's worthwhile to watch the birds in the back garden. But he said more often than not, when he's sitting there bored, he starts writing. And, I think that's the advice every writer ever gives, is one of the things you need to do if you want to be a writer is to just write. So I've heard something similar from him, and I find a lot of his advice very fruitful. Thanks for sharing that. Fred Rogers was known for doing meditative practices as a sort of parlor trick. Most of his commencement speeches, very famously, he would invite everyone to pause for 1 minute and to think about everyone who loved them into existence. Now, that's a sort of mindfulness technique or a meditation practice. It's gratitude is baked into it, but what he's doing is practicing the art of silence as an instructive way for an entire group of people. Apparently, he did this at dinner parties and things of that nature. He did the egg timer thing. The show itself is set off by the slowing down, but he did not fill the show with sound because he felt there needed to be moments of silence, and he himself sat silently as a spiritual pursuit. One of the writers who's written about him and the religious theological tendencies said there's a bit of Quaker in him. And for those of you who aren't aware, the Quakers were an early American spiritual tradition, very, very strongly based in Pennsylvania, but they spread. And the thing about a Quaker religious meeting, they're often called Friends, by the way, the Society of Friends. But one of the things that's very indicative of a Quaker meeting is that there's no preacher. And the sacrament there is sort of silence. You would sit in a sanctuary or a hall by yourself in the quiet, because there's the notion that everyone has the divine spark in them. And so we're listening to God, or listening for God, or listening for the deeper self. That's a tradition that we see in every, almost across all traditions. I think of Jesus himself in the Gospel of Mark. It tells us in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus, went away to pray, and it says the disciples had to go searching for him. He went to a solitary place, a place of, sometimes it's called desert or wilderness, and sometimes it's up a mountainside, but they have to go actually find him. And it's usually a withdrawing from the crowds. He does a lot of crowd work, teaching. He does a lot of miracle work, compassion, works of compassion, and then he recedes. He goes away, and they have to go search for him. So he seeks solitude, and in the solitude, quiet. So this is, like I said, a tradition that is perennial. It's throughout various traditions. There's something there. For your case and the one I share with you, Neil Gaiman, it actually it's almost utilitarian in a sense. Silence can help produce creativity. For the Quaker, it is specifically so that you can more aptly hear from the divine. I think for Jesus, there's not a lot of instruction, but it seems to indicate a communal aspect of communing with the divine. But I wanted to talk about another story that really struck me that I've come across in the past. And I've got it pulled up here. I'm just going to do more summary than anything. But NPR reported, and I believe this reporting was back all the way back, April 28th, 2010. And I heard it then, but I got the story pulled up. And it's Michelle Martin is the host, and she's reporting that there's at Donaldson Correction Facility, which is a maximum security facility in Bessemer, Alabama. There was an offering for inmates to learn a 10-day exercise. And for 10 days, they would work on 100 hours of silent meditation. The sort of meditation is called Vipassana, right? Now, this is a very instructed and traditioned form of meditation. But the things that they said happened during, and you can find this, by the way, in a documentary called, I believe it's called The Dharma. Let me make sure I have that correctly. The Dharma Brothers. Well, I'll come back and make sure I have that correct. The Dhamma Brothers, okay? The new film, The Dhamma Brothers, follows, yeah, the two people who created it called The Dhamma Brothers, pardon me. But the thing is if I can summarize the kind of the thrust of the story is that if you go back to Shawshank Redemption, that great film, one of the things that Morgan Freeman's character says, like, I'm the only guilty man in Shawshank. And that's kind of a trope, right? Like everyone in prison is denying why they're there. And I don't know that that's true or whatnot, but it's definitely a stereotype or a trope. And apparently here in this Bessemer correctional facility. That may be part of it, but the way that prisoners present themselves is very much as if they're living in a state of threat everywhere. And I think we can all imagine that prison may very well be a threatening place. And so in a world where threat is basically your environment, what the one of the ways to survive is to prop yourself up in some ways. Sometimes it's physically, a lot of times it's emotionally. You try to put up that emotional wall that says I'm not vulnerable, I don't miss my wife and kids, or I'm strong, I'm tough, you can't take advantage of me. In a lot of ways, that might be ethical and moral. Like you do resist while you're there. You do resist the reason for your lockup. You do say you're innocent or whatnot. Now, I'm not going to get into it, but I'll simply say it's called a correctional facility, which is a euphemism as far as I'm concerned. I do think that we need a good philosophy of discipline in our culture, which we don't. I think retribution is probably immoral. I think rehabilitation is probably most ethical, but and correctional is a word that goes along with it. I'm just not certain that we have a philosophy of correction and rehabilitation. And I know it's complicated to do in practice, but it seems to me that we need to do some work here. Well, these prisoners who participated in the Basana program report changing significantly their feelings. They report actually having experiences where they come to terms with themselves, what they had done, their vulnerabilities, why they're there. And it's in fact even been the reporting reveals some risk because those vulnerabilities are exposed to themselves, and then they have to deal with deeper psychological realities that they're able to otherwise bottle up or compartmentalize so that they can navigate the world they feel is safer for them. And it was an incredible story about how powerful meditation can be, even in a place like a prison. There is something that can happen in silence that is profound. It is also, it shows some of the dramatic and dangerous edge to it because on the other side, intentional silence there in these meditation practices, which were pretty hefty, that it provided a very healthy avenue and healthy response to their emotional, spiritual, ethical life. However, if you were to lock someone up in solitary confinement for an extended period of time, it would be considered torture because we are, in fact, social creatures, and being in the silence and the solitude for so long can have devastating effects on one's psyche. So, silence clearly is a tool, but showing the power of the tool, just like any good tool is as powerful and effective as it can be, it can also be used as a tool for harm. So man, it's a really robust practice that I think most people today don't take on intentionally. Pause for a sip of coffee here and see if you have any questions.
Sure. No, I'll probably edit this out. The only thing that's coming up for me at the moment as you're talking, because it's really great, is this reminds me of the power of moderation, right? So if something is a wonderful tool, but can be used negatively if too much, moderation is the right approach.
Well, don't edit that out. I mean, maybe edit it around it, but say, yeah, I think you're right. Moderation is a tool, and in the world of virtues, we have temperance listed, and I also like the way that Aristotle understands virtue and ethics. I mean, virtue is often like a median between extremes, and in a very character forming way, I often think about how, because I have the capacity to be a good conversationalist or a good talker, I also have the same capacity on the other side to talk too much and not listen enough. And so the virtue or the ethic is that median between extremes, right? It's working towards that median point of view. So yeah, temperance and moderation, it's very, very important. But let's just talk out loud right now, Alan. Let's talk about it. Like, how loud is the world?
In in some ways, incredibly loud. It depends on what world you're talking about, right? Like, are we talking about walking down the busy street? Or are we talking about, a hike in the woods?
We'll talk about anything. I mean, when I say how is the world, I guess I'm just thinking about what's one's experience.
What's
You
one's
know,
experience? Yeah,
one's daily experience to me is probably pretty filled with sound, but also sound that is not bird song. I would suggest that whether it's an audible noise or at least or the still the inaudible sound, right? Like let's just be euphemistic for a second and say that like online world is loud, even
sure.
though just reading it, right? There's just a lot of data and a lot of screams in bold typeface that are coming into our ears, our mental ears.
Sure.
I don't know. I mean, I just think it's a very loud place.
It is. It is. And I think that even in my situation where I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of a third to a half of my day is actually spent in solitude. I'm usually in my work area, and I don't actually have any persons around. It's still very noisy from that perspective, in that it's a constant rat race to get all the things done that need to be done, and
Mm,
that can be just as loud. No, I agree that we're inundated with too much information.
mm.
Information age. I think that this actually comes back to the moderation idea, is that every time we hit, you know, an age, we have too much of the thing. We had too much industry, we have too much information. And I think that the only way to, deal with that is for the pendulum to swing, and for us to get back to some point of moderation. What I think tends to happen from my view of history is that when something is overwrought, we have a tendency to eventually some generation comes along and totally rejects it. And then we have to swing back and forth a little bit until we find, the right balance of stuff.
Well, that's interesting because so I'd say that I would respond by saying that even though a 30-year day, is alone and therefore perhaps silent, you said there's a rat race
Yeah,
and there's a lot
just,
to
just
get
as
done
loud.
and a lot of information. And then I'm also thinking of Sherry Turkle's famous book that came out probably around the same time as this article on NPR. She's an MIT psychologist, and it's called Alone Together: Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other. And she talks about several themes in that book that I think still hold true 14 years later. But I guess in a lot of the studies they did with people who were on social media, I guess at the time it was basically Facebook, but that though they knew that whatever they put online could be read by billions of people, they felt as though they were alone. So the psychological dissonance there definitely created this void where I think the void where content can be created in ways that is not reflective of actually the silence of being alone and writing privately in a journal. And then makes me think about how that last little phrase you said about the pendulum swinging back and forth until we find a middle. I think that's why we need practices, spiritual practices and corrective practices, because I don't trust the world to get there with its inertia pushing back and forth. I think we in intentional communities and we as individuals, and I would like to say intentional communities because I do think churches and families and groups that are smaller can do this, but I think that we have to seek it where it is not. And with the world being so wild and crazy and loud and whatnot, or maybe it's fast information, that kind of thing, are just full of just meaningless shouting, whatnot. That's where I think contemporary people start to romanticize the monastery. It's interesting because in the age of decline of religious institutions of all types, the one that isn't in decline is the monastery. People are going to monasteries exponentially in increased way. People are they're consuming the monastery, whether they're going to pray with the monks on a couple hours, take a retreat, going to the gift shop, and just walking the grounds. They're going to monasteries, and there's this lure to it. This romantic pull. It's seen as sort of a haven away from our technocentric, loud, noisy, bustery world of the information age. Yet I think that if you were to really talk to any monk, and I've been blessed to know several monks who have taken up that vow of poverty and chastity and silence at times, it's very challenging. It's a very challenging world to have the simple world of just work and prayer. And one of the challenges I believe that they face, one of many, is that in the solitude or in the silence specifically, they are very present to themselves. And that is not always a warm and fuzzy reality. When we're faced with who we really are, when all of the curated self falls away, when we see the actual footprint that we make in other people's lives, when we reflect, it can be somewhat harmful or damaging, or at least painful to us to realize that that's just one thing. We may find that we don't like everything out about ourselves. It's easier to do in silence to realize that we have areas that they're called the growing edges, the areas that we need to grow. Because otherwise, we could distract ourselves or more easily cover up and justify our behavior. I don't know if you've ever noted that for yourself, Alan, or if you've ever had these moments where you had just to be away to just kind of even get a handle on who you are. But I can give you a quick little story, and that is
Please
when I
do.
started my meditation practice, I was challenged by somebody in my life to do it. So I was 5 days in. I was committing 10 minutes a day for 10 days. I mean, I'll just be blunt. I was using Headspace, the app, and I was just someone said, try it. You need a mindfulness practice and all that. But I found that it wasn't just a mindfulness practice, because that's something we can talk about as well on another episode. But it was just the fifth day sitting in my study with with nothing on, no podcast, no book, no music. The doors were shut, and I was silent. And I realized that I was just breathing, and I was just doing the scan of my body. And I realized, wow, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. In the last few years, you moved across the country, you had a second child, you moved from this job to this job, you moved house, your PhD advisor retired in the middle of it. All these different things happened, and then dot dot dot, and you're not handling it well, man. Like, it took that a little bit of time to realize that I had been just going on autopilot, working away, scratching off boxes off a list, getting things done, putting out fires. So many fires, Alan. So many fires. Fielding irritated phone calls, dealing with other
Sure.
people's anxiety. And people want to give you their anxiety. I mean, goodness sakes, do they ever? And everything's urgent, the tyranny of the urgent. And I was trying to be faithful and good at my job and my role in the world and my role as a dad. And I was handling it like that, which meant that I was not attending to myself. And this practice introduced silence to me for the first time in a little while. And I realized,
Sure.
oh, this is affecting you and you're not handling it. You're ignoring it. Now, that was a mercy. That was a grace in that moment to realize that, because then I could pick a different path. And that's how it was a spiritual tool in that moment, like an effective tool. You might say that it's not always just a tool to another, it's not just a means to a greater ethical end. I could argue with the Quakers and probably with Jesus that silence itself might be, in some senses, the point to find ourselves in a communion with that which is greater than anything that could be thought, that which is greater than ourselves. That might be the avenue for it, is in silence, when we cut out distraction. There's this form of prayer that we'll talk about on another episode, but the person who talks a lot about it, Thomas Keating, talks about this form of prayer being divine psychology, like in the silence of it, because this prayer is not a speaking logocentric prayer, that there's this capacity we have to be healed psychologically by being wrapped up in the embrace of the divine. And it comes through that, putting down your pencils, everybody, closing your laptops, turning off, being quiet.
All quiet except the sip of coffee.
Well, I didn't know if I was saying anything that would engender thought, but I.
No, 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 it's okay. It's okay. I was just teasing. So you're talking about this experience of realizing that you needed to get away in order to be silent, in order to
Mhm.
refocus and take care of yourself based on the fact that you weren't taking care of the situation in your life adequately, or you weren't handling it well. That's the way you phrased it. Yes.
Yep.
I would say that this is something, okay, so I'm an introvert. And I have to expend a lot of energy in order to be around people, in order to communicate, especially if it's more than one or two people. And I always, every single time, walk away from those situations, kind of kicking myself because I feel like I did something thoughtless or inappropriate socially. and 99 times out of 100, no one else in the room felt that. I'm just completely overanalyzing everything that I do all the time. Right. But as a result of that, I'm in a situation that where I do make make alone time for me to sort of like re-energize and rethink about things. I learned this about me a long time ago, that I needed to have space and needed to have silence and needed to have silence for pretty good amounts of time, in order to function well. It's part of the reason I started drawing again instead of just always playing music, is because I really do use a lot of drawing time as meditative time, because there's a portion of drawing where you're designing and you're having to really, really think hard. And then there's a part of drawing that's very thoughtless, where I can really use it as a meditation because I don't have to think very hard. And that's been what's the right way to say this? It's been a really powerful way for me to balance myself in my later life. I gave up on a lot of those kinds of pursuits in my late teens because I thought I was going to be a rock star, and I was going to do all this wonderful musical work. And somewhere in my late 20s, I realized that personality-wise, I needed to go in a different direction. And that was when I started really attacking media production and more specifically illustration and totally using it as somewhere in the middle of it. I realized the meditative quality of it and that it was helpful for me psychologically. So I hear what you're saying and I agree, but I think that the danger for me is that I don't have a tendency to get away. I don't have a tendency to like think, oh, I need to like go off to a monastery and walk the grounds in order to get away because I already have so much of that baked into my regular routine. And sometimes I think that that's a bad thing because here's the part of it that I need to work on, right? My family doesn't have meditation in any sense baked into their routine. They need to get away, and I don't do a good job of supporting them in those circumstances.
Ah, okay. Well, it sounds like you know that. And knowing about yourself is a very helpful practice
Yeah,
of all types. But I'd say that what strikes me about your situation is that, well, in mine, talking about for those of us who can get away to a monastery or go a hike on in the North Georgia mountains or something like that, just get out for the afternoon. We're incredibly privileged. But solitude and silence, or rather, just this again, bringing it back, just focusing mostly on silence today. It is actually something that is not for just the privileged few, as the case of the Bessemer, Alabama shows. This meditation happens in a correctional facility. And I think that we can start in small ways to practice different silences. And if your practice is very, introverted and very quiet because of that, it's probably helpful for you to put in silent practices that are not in keeping with your typical day-to-day routine. So you are like, I'm carving out this time for this practice that is different, if only to punch up the experience, if you will. If every day you're a swimmer, I mean, I started swimming when I got sick with my liver disease that I've gone through, and I couldn't do any other workout. My body was very fragile, so the doctor wanted me to swim in swim laps, which I don't like to do. I find it challenging in a way that it's just not natural to me. But I started to love it because in the water, I didn't have music, I didn't have anything but the water. And so it brought me the silence actually either helped me kind of like dump my feelings and thoughts, just let them drain through my body and into the water, or I had tons of great ideas. And it was through that kind of silence. But if I'm a swimmer, I'm doing that every day. I imagine that I'm going to find myself getting into routine thought practices and routine habits, maybe just planning my day or something. And so it can be helpful if I want to really accentuate this practice for my spiritual and moral well-being. It can be helpful to then say, okay, well, I need to find 5 to 10 minutes today just to be silent, not to speak, do something different in a different setting. So I just think that it can be a pretty flexible and versatile tool that we utilize. Like there's truth that in silence for your the pursuit of your creativity, Alan, and anyone else's who's interested, it can help us in silence what ends up happening is we find out that all the media and storytelling and conversations that we've been taking in, our bodies are like a prism and they refract and reflect differently in us, and then they inspire us to make something else. So we don't ever make anything that's 100% original. It's
Sure.
all based on other things that have influenced us, but it will be original in how it shapes through you. Like, and that happens out in the silence. We discover these things coming out of us very freely. However, if we're only being, like I'm saying, we're just being silent for the sake of creativity, it might be beneficial to you to go find a way to be silent and without thinking, oh, this is how I'm going to be creative, but I'm just doing it for another reason. I want to take this and just kind of turn it to the public real quickly.
Absolutely.
I think that if we are practicing silence, I think we're going to be radically countercultural. And I think silence can be a form of resistance. We have, and I'm not the first to say that. I mean, a lot of writers have said that. And I just we have this hyper consumerist culture that shapes media content where and reporting, it's no longer important to be right, it's important to be first. And I don't think, the Olympics that just concluded, there were, 1,001 hot takes on the opening ceremony before I think even people understood what it was, or I don't even think people still do, but they had opinions and hot takes and they were saying them on all sides of the points of view. And then really all I know it did was really upset people. The event itself upset some people, and then people were upset by those who were upset, and then they were all upset even more at each other. And it didn't help. And I think silence can be applied in a broader way than just my own private spiritual touch point. It can, firstly on our first level kind of spiritual touch point, silence can actually help us understand ourselves more so that we can be better for other people and better in how we talk to other people. But when you apply it large in a more large setting like that, not having to talk or speak or share on every point can really save us from a lot of heartache and headache. I mean, there are relationships being damaged by people having to say their 2 cents on politics right now. And not every thought we have is a good one. Not every thought we have is a charitable one. And I'm betting in a few years' time, after somebody saying something offhand, off the cuff, someone else being offended, and a back and forth exchange, especially on social media or heightened by the dinner table at Thanksgiving dinner. Years go by. I'm betting that people sit there and go, I'm mad at so and so, or I don't like so and so, but they don't really know why or care that much anymore about what it was. But the feelings continue, the feelings they carry. So it can be very helpful to us as a tool for the public world we all engage to practice silence more often. And it's radical and it's countercultural because in today's day and age, we're all brands, and you have to say what you think and you have to put your point of view out there and all that. But I'm going to double down with Mr. Rogers, and my brand is hopefully going to be a prophet like he was. He was a gentle prophet. My brand is going to be slow down sometimes and to sometimes stop speaking. And then to also with courage see the dignity in other people and to have the courage to talk about the really hard stuff we all go through. Those are some brand things from Rogers that I would love to live into, you know?
Love it.
But I think that's how silence itself can be a wonderful tool in the toolkit of our public persona and outward facing self.
Mhm.
And it is most aptly a spiritual tool baked into all the traditions. Alan, do you have any more thoughts or questions or concerns or stories about it that you
No, man,
take?
I think that your concluding summary there is about as apt as I could think of.
All right. Well, my friends, go and find some silence. And when you're there in the silence, don't be worried if your mind wanders. Just simply be and be kind to yourself. God bless.